I still remember the exact moment my daughter looked at me, the man who changed her diapers, who worked double shifts so she could go to college, who cried quietly in the hospital parking lot, the night she was born because I couldn't believe something so perfect had come from someone like me. And she looked at the gift I had spent 7 months of my life restoring, and she said, "Dad, what am I supposed to do with this? It's useless." She didn't whisper it. She didn't say it with any softness. She said it the way you'd say something to a stranger, cold, flat, almost annoyed. I didn't say anything. I just nodded slowly, picked up my coffee cup from her kitchen counter, and walked to the window. I stood there looking out at the yard, the same yard where she used to chase fireflies in her bare feet when she was 6 years old, and I swallowed everything I was feeling down so deep that I'm not sure it ever fully came back up. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just stayed quiet. That's what I've always done. That's what men like me do. But what happened exactly 1 week later, and what she said to me when she found out, that is the story I need to tell you, because it changed my life, and maybe, just maybe, it will change the way you see yours. My name is Gerald. Gerald Ambrose Whitfield. I'm 67 years old, and I've spent most of those years working with my hands. I'm not a famous man. I never drove a fancy car. I never wore expensive suits or took vacations to places you'd see in magazines. For 31 years, I worked as a machinist at a manufacturing plant in a small town in Ohio. I fixed things for a living. Gears, engines, metal parts that most people couldn't even name. I understood how things worked, how each tiny piece fit into a larger whole, how patience and precision could turn something broken into something beautiful again. My wife, Margaret, God rest her soul, used to say that I had a gift, not for making things, she'd say, but for seeing things, seeing the value in what others had thrown away. Margaret passed 4 years ago, breast cancer. We had 38 years together, and I will tell you honestly, I have not been the same man since she left. Not even close. We had 2 children together. Our son, Thomas, who is 40, one now and lives in Denver with his wife, Brenda, and their 2 boys. And our daughter, Cassandra Cassie, we always called her, who is 38, and lives about 40 minutes from me, in a nice house in the suburbs with her husband, Derek, and their teenage daughter, Lily. I want you to understand something before I go further. I love both of my children completely. There is nothing complicated about that love. It is total, and it is real, and it has never changed, not once, not even on the worst days. But love, real love, doesn't protect you from being hurt by the people you love. In fact, I think it makes it worse. Let me tell you about the watch. My father, Cassie's grandfather, was a man named Howard Whitfield. He emigrated from England when he was 23 years old with almost nothing in his pockets. He worked in a coal yard, then a factory, then eventually saved enough to open a small repair shop. He fixed clocks and watches mostly, old ones, the kind that other people considered garbage. When my father died, I was 19 years old. He left me almost nothing. There was no money, no property, just a small wooden box that he kept on his workbench. Inside that box was a pocket watch. It was a 1921 Patek Philippe, a hand wound open face pocket watch, gold, cased with an ivory, colored enamel dial and blued steel hands. It had been given to my grandfather by a wealthy man whose parlor clock my grandfather had repaired back in England. The man had said, "I have no use for a watch that doesn't run. But you, Howard, you'll make it sing again." My grandfather never did make it sing. He passed before he could, and then my father inherited it, and then he passed it to me. I kept it for almost 40 years in that same wooden box, wrapped in a cloth, sitting on the shelf in my garage. I knew it was special. I knew it had a story, but I also knew it was broken. Several internal components were damaged, the mainspring was snapped, and the enamel dial had 2 fine hairline cracks. To most people, it was a beautiful paperweight. To me, it was a promise I'd made to my father and hadn't kept yet. When Margaret died, I went through what I can only describe as a long, gray season of emptiness. I stopped cooking real meals. I stopped talking much. Thomas would call, and I'd say I was fine. Cassie would visit sometimes, but she was busy. Derek had just started his new business. Lily was in school, and I never wanted to be a burden. One afternoon, about 8 months ago, I walked into my garage looking for something, I can't even remember what, and I opened that wooden box. I sat down on my old stool, and I held that watch for a long time. And I thought about my father, and his father, and Margaret, who always said I had a gift for seeing what others couldn't, and I made a decision. I was going to restore it. What followed was the hardest and most meaningful project of my life. I want you to understand, restoring a watch like this is not a weekend hobby. A Patek Philippe from 1921 is a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Every single component, and there are hundreds of them, some smaller than a grain of rice, has to be treated with extraordinary care. The wrong move, a hand that shakes for half a second at the wrong moment, and something irreplaceable is gone forever. I took a refresher course online. I ordered specialty tools. I reached out, nervously, like a student, to a retired horologist named Bernard, who lived 2 towns over, and who had spent 40 years working on fine timepieces. Bernard was in his 80s, half blind in one eye, and the most patient human being I have ever met. He became something like a teacher, something like a friend. We worked on weekends mostly, at Bernard's kitchen table, under a magnifying lamp, with tiny tweezers and fine brushes and oils that smelled like something from another century. I replaced the mainspring. I cleaned every gear and jewel and pivot. I sourced a period, correct crown, which took 11 weeks to find, from a collector in Switzerland who almost didn't want to sell it. I had the case professionally polished by a craftsman in New York. The enamel dial, which I was most afraid to touch, was sent to a specialist restorer in Germany who spent 6 weeks working on those 2 hairline cracks until they were, and this is her word, invisible. 7 months. 7 months of evenings and weekends and early mornings. 7 months of learning and failing and trying again. 7 months of sitting at that magnifying lamp, thinking about my father and my grandfather and Margaret, and everything that connects us to each other across time. When it was finally done, when I wound it gently for the first time, and heard the soft, steady tick of that movement that hadn't run in decades, I sat in Bernard's kitchen and I wept. Not from sadness, from something else, something I don't quite have a word for. Bernard put his old hand on my shoulder and said, "Your grandfather would have been very pleased, Gerald." I had one purpose in mind from the very beginning. I wanted to give it to Cassie. Cassie was my father's favorite grandchild. He used to call her his little treasure. She would sit on his knee as a small girl and listen to him tell stories about England, about clocks, about the way time moved differently depending on how you paid attention to it. He died when Cassie was 9. I always believed some part of her father, her grandfather, lived inside her still. The curious part, the careful part. I wanted her to have something that connected her to all of us. To me, to her grandfather, to his father, to a chain of ordinary men who had tried, in their own quiet ways, to take care of the people they loved. I also, and I'll be honest about this, wanted her to have something valuable. Not just emotionally valuable, actually valuable. Because Cassie and Derek had been going through some financial stress. Derek's business had hit a rough patch. I'd overheard enough stressed phone calls during Sunday dinners to know that things weren't easy. I thought, a watch like this, if she ever truly needed it, could be sold. It was like giving her a safety net wrapped in a family story. I brought it to her house on a Sunday afternoon in early March. I'd put it in a small velvet box, and I'd written her a letter of 3 pages, handwritten explaining the history of the watch. My grandfather, my father, the 7 months of work, what it meant, why I wanted her to have it. The whole family was there. Derek's mother, Patricia, who was visiting for the weekend. Thomas had driven in from Denver with Brenda. It was meant to be a special moment. I handed Cassie the box. I was nervous, actually nervous, like a young man on a first date. My hands weren't quite steady. She opened it. She looked at the watch for a moment. Then she read the first paragraph of my letter. Then she looked up. "Dad," she said, "what am I supposed to do with this?" "It's yours," I said. "It belonged to your great-grandfather. I restored it for you. A pocket watch." Derek said from across the room. He laughed not cruelly, but carelessly. "What are we supposed to do with a pocket watch, Gerald?" "It's a Patek Philippe," I said quietly. "From 1921. It's quite valuable, Dad," Cassie said, and her voice had that tone, the one that told me she was already irritated, already moving on in her mind. "I appreciate the effort. I really do. But it's just, nobody uses pocket watches. It's useless. Useless." That word sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Brenda was looking at her phone. Lily, my granddaughter, sweet, quiet Lily, looked at me with something like apology in her eyes. She was 16, and she had more grace in that moment than every adult in the room. I picked up my coffee cup. I walked to the window. I looked out at the yard, and I said nothing. I stayed another hour. I ate the lunch Cassie had made. I talked with Thomas about his job. I played a card game with Lily. I did not mention the watch again. Before I left, I picked up the velvet box from where Cassie had set it on the kitchen counter, between a stack of mail and a fruit bowl, as if it were a decorative object she hadn't decided where to store yet. I picked it up and I put it in my coat pocket. She didn't notice. On the drive home, I kept both hands on the wheel, and I drove exactly the speed limit, and I did not let myself feel anything until I pulled into my own driveway. Then I sat in the car for a while. I thought about my father, who had worked in a coal yard so his family wouldn't be cold. I thought about my grandfather, who had come to a new country with nothing and built something from nothing. I thought about Margaret, who used to reach across the kitchen table and take my hand for no reason at all, just to let me know she was there. I thought about Cassie at 6 years old, chasing fireflies. Then I went inside, put the watch back on the shelf in my garage, and I made a decision. Now here is where I need to stop and tell you something. Something I hadn't told anyone, not Thomas, not Cassie, not even Bernard. About 3 months into the restoration, when I had taken the watch fully apart and was beginning to understand exactly what I had, I'd done some research. Serious research. I'd contacted a specialist at a major auction house in New York, a woman named Claire, who dealt specifically in rare timepieces. I'd sent her photographs, detailed photographs of every component, the case, the dial, the movement. She had called me back within 24 hours. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, and her voice had a particular kind of careful excitement, the kind professionals use when they don't want to raise your hopes too high before they've confirmed everything. "What you have is quite extraordinary. The reference number on your movement. Are you sitting down?" I was sitting down. "Your watch is a Patek Philippe reference 96, manufactured in 1921. But more specifically, it appears to be a very early example with a specific movement configuration that we have only seen in 3 other known examples worldwide. If the restoration is done correctly and the provenance can be documented, which from what you've described, This watch could achieve between $100,000 and $150,000 at auction. I was very still for a long moment. I see, I said. Mr. Whitfield, are you all right? Yes, I said. I'm fine, thank you, Claire. I hung up the phone and sat in my garage for a long time. And then I made a choice. I decided I would restore it fully and give it to Cassie, as planned. I would tell her clearly in the letter that it was valuable, that she should look into it, that it was not just a sentimental object, but a genuine asset. The letter I wrote her was 3 pages. I told her everything, the history, the restoration, the conversation with the auction specialist. Everything. She read 1 paragraph. She called it useless. So on that drive home with the watch back in my coat pocket, I made a different plan. I called Claire. I will not draw this part out longer than it needs to be. Claire and her team completed their formal assessment within 4 days. The provenance documentation, letters, photographs, my grandfather's name in an old English newspaper article about a clock repair in 1918 was enough to satisfy the auction house's standards. The watch was entered into a specialized timepiece auction the following Thursday. It sold in 11 minutes. Final price, $131,000. The buyer was a private collector from Switzerland. Claire told me he had been searching for this specific reference variant for over a decade. After the auction house commission, I received a wire transfer of $111,350 into my bank account. I sat at my kitchen table, looking at the number on my laptop screen for a very long time. Then I called Bernard. It sold, I said. How much? He asked. I told him. There was a long silence. Your grandfather, Bernard said finally, was a very wise man. He was. I agreed. I thought about what to do with the money for a few days. I was not a man with extravagant wants. My house was paid off. My needs were simple. I decided to set aside a significant portion for Lily's college education, quietly, in a trust she would receive at 18. That felt right. That felt like something my father would have done, something Margaret would have smiled at. The rest I kept. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace, and then Cassie found out. It was a Thursday evening, 9 days after I'd given her the watch, and 8 days after the sale, when my phone rang. It was Cassie. Dad, 1 word, but I knew her voice. I knew every register of it from the time she was born. And what I heard in that 1 word was not love. It was not warmth. It was something tight and sharp. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. I heard about the watch. I waited. Lily told me she looked it up online and found the auction listing. Dad, it sold for $130,000. $131, I said gently. That money, she said, should be shared with the family. That watch was Grandpa's. It belongs to all of us. You had no right to just sell it without talking to us. I was very quiet. Cassie, I said, I offered it to you 1 week ago. I handed it to you in a velvet box. That's not, you didn't tell me what it was worth. The letter, I said. The 3-page letter I wrote you. I explained the conversation with the auction specialist. I told you it could be worth over $100,000. I asked you to read the letter. There was a pause. I didn't read the whole letter. I know, I said. Dad, that's not fair. You should have told me out loud. You should have explained. I tried, Cassie. When I mentioned it was a Patek Philippe, when I said it was valuable, you said quite valuable. I thought you meant like a few $100. A Patek Philippe from 1921. I said carefully, is not a few $100. That is something you could have looked up. Another pause. Longer this time. Dad, I want half. I closed my eyes. Half. I repeated. It's a family heirloom. It belonged to all of us. I should get at least half. $65,000. Derek and I are struggling right now. You know that. You know how hard things have been. And you just sold something that belonged to our family, and you kept all the money, Cassie, I said. And my voice was very calm, very steady. 1 week ago, you held that watch in your hands, and you called it useless. You set it on your kitchen counter between a pile of mail and a fruit bowl. I picked it up on my way out the door, and you didn't even notice. Silence. I'm sorry I didn't read the letter, she said, but it didn't sound like sorry. It sounded like a move in a negotiation. I know, I said. So you'll share it. No, I said. Dad, good night, Cassie. I hung up. What followed were 2 of the hardest weeks of my life. Cassie called back 3 times that night. I didn't answer. She texted. Long messages, some angry, some tearful, some that made me feel like the cruelest man alive. Derek called me once and tried to explain their financial situation in a way that felt like pressure. Thomas called, having heard from Cassie, and he was gentler about it, but still seemed to think I should consider the family dynamic. Patricia, Derek's mother, who had been in the room when Cassie called the watch useless, apparently told anyone who would listen that I was being selfish, that a father should support his children. That money causes such terrible problems in families. I heard all of it. I let it arrive and I sat with it, and I did not respond in anger. What hurt most was not the demands. People do foolish things when they're stressed and frightened about money. I understood that. What hurt was the revision of history that seemed to be happening in real time. The way the story was being rewritten, so that the watch had always been a cherished family treasure, rather than a useless object that had been set between a fruit bowl and a stack of mail. I thought about my father, about how he used to say, "Gerald, a man's character isn't shown by how he acts when things are going well. It's shown by what he does when he thinks no one is watching." Nobody was watching me now. Nobody had been watching me for years, really. Margaret was gone. My children were busy. I was just a quiet old man in a house in Ohio, talking to a retired horologist on weekends and eating toast for dinner. But I knew what I had done. I knew every hour of those 7 months. I knew the cost of the tools and the phone calls and the weeks of waiting for components to arrive from Switzerland and Germany. I knew the emotional cost, the mornings I sat at the workbench thinking about my father and feeling the particular grief of all the things you never got to say to the people who shaped you. No one could take that from me, and no one could tell me I owed them something for it. It was Lily who changed things. Not dramatically, not with a grand gesture, just with a phone call on a quiet Tuesday morning. "Grandpa, hi, sweetheart. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Her voice was young and careful. For what Mom said about the watch. I was there, and I should have said something, and I didn't. "You don't need to apologize for your mother, Lily." "I know, but I felt bad. I could tell it hurt you when you walked to the window." I was very still. "You noticed that?" I said. "Yeah." A pause. "I also read the letter, the one you wrote Mom. She left it on the counter, and I read the whole thing." "Did you?" "It was beautiful, Grandpa, the part about great. Grandpa teaching you to see what others couldn't, and what you said about Grandma Margaret." I cried a little. I didn't say anything for a moment. "The letter wasn't for you to read," I said, "but I'm glad you did. Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you give it to Mom instead of keeping it? You must have known it was worth a lot. Before you gave it to her, I mean." I thought about how to answer this honestly. "Because I wanted her to have something real," I said. "Something that came from our family. Something that could help her if she ever truly needed it. And because I suppose I thought the story of it would matter to her, the way it mattered to me." "It should have," Lily said quietly. "People are complicated, sweetheart." "I know, but Grandpa, what you did, those 7 months, working on that watch, that was love. That's what that was, and she called it useless." I swallowed. "She didn't know," I said. "She didn't want to know," Lily said, and then, softly, I would have wanted to know. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call ended, and I made one final decision. I'm going to tell you now what I actually did, because this is the part that matters. I set aside $40,000 in an education trust for Lily. She will receive it when she turns 18, to use for college or any other beginning she chooses. I instructed my lawyer to make sure the terms were clear. It was from her grandfather, and it was unconditional. No strings, no expectations. I used $20,000 to do some repairs on my house that had been waiting too long. The roof, the back porch where Margaret and I used to sit in the evenings. Fixing it felt like honoring her. I donated $15,000 to a small nonprofit in our county that provides vocational training to young people who can't afford trade school. My father would have appreciated that. Men who work with their hands deserve support. And with the remainder, I traveled, quietly, modestly, the way I do everything. I went to England, for the first time in my life, to the small town where my grandfather had been born. I stood in the street outside a building that had once, 100 years ago, been a clock repair shop. I stood there in the rain for about 10 minutes. I felt something lift from me, something I'd been carrying a long time. I visited Bernard's daughter, who lives in London, with a bottle of good whiskey, and thanks for what her father had meant to me. Bernard himself had passed 6 months after the restoration was complete, quietly, in his sleep, the way he would have wanted. I missed him very much. I did not give Cassie any money. I did not give Thomas any money, though he never asked. I loved them both completely, and I owed them nothing. About a month after the sale, I drove to Cassie's house on a Sunday. I didn't call first. I just drove. Derek answered the door. He looked surprised, then uncomfortable. "Gerald, hey, is Cassie home? She's in the kitchen. Come on in." Cassie was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She looked tired. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. When she saw me, something moved across her face, guilt, or the shadow of it. "Dad," she said. I sat down across from her. I put my hands flat on the table. I looked at her for a moment, really looked at her. "My daughter, 38 years old, the little girl who chased fireflies. I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm not here to make you feel bad. I just want to say a few things, and I'd like you to listen." She nodded. "I spent 7 months restoring that watch," I said. 7 months, not because it was going to make me rich, not because I had nothing better to do, because it connected me to your grandfather, and his father, and to your mother, who always told me I had a gift for seeing what others couldn't. I wanted to give you that connection. I wanted you to have something real and lasting and full of meaning, because the world is full of things that are empty and temporary, and I hoped you would understand the difference. Cassie's eyes were wet. "I wrote you 3 pages. I said. I told you exactly what the watch was, what it was worth, what it meant. I handed it to you in a velvet box in front of the whole family, and you called it useless. Dad, I'm not finished." Gently, not harshly. "You called it useless, and you put it between your mail and your fruit bowl, and when I sold it, a watch that I had restored entirely with my own hands and my own money and my own time, you demanded half. You didn't apologize for the word you used. You didn't ask me about the 7 months. You asked me for money. The kitchen was very quiet. I don't want an argument, Cassie, and I don't want an apology that you don't mean. I just want you to understand something." I reached into my coat pocket. I placed a small velvet box on the table. She stared at it. "What is that?" "Open it." She opened it slowly. Inside was a small card and something flat and shining. The card read, in my handwriting, "For Lily, for her beginning, from Grandpa, with love that doesn't keep score." The shining thing was a printout of the trust document. $40,000 in Lily's name. Cassie stared at it. Her hand began to shake slightly. "You gave it to Lily," she whispered. "The connection," I wanted to give you? I said I found a way to give it to her instead. She read the letter, the whole letter. She called me on a Tuesday morning to say she was sorry for something that wasn't even her fault. That is a person who understands what things are worth, not the money, the meaning. Cassie put her face in her hands. What she said next, and I'm going to tell you her exact words, was not an explosion. It was not a dramatic scene. It was just a woman sitting at a kitchen table, crying, saying something that had probably been true for a long time. I've been so tired, Dad. I've been so scared about the money and Derek's business and the house, and I've been so tired that I stopped seeing things right. I stopped being who I used to be. I know, I said. I didn't read the letter because I was scared of needing to feel something. Because if I let myself feel things right now, I think I might fall apart. I know that too. The way you looked when you walked to the window, she said. I knew. Even in that moment, I knew. I just didn't know how to fix it. I reached across the table, and I took her hand, my daughter's hand, which I had held first when she was 20 minutes old. You fix it, I said, by being here, by showing up, by choosing to see what's real instead of what's easy. That's all any of us can do. She cried for a while. I let her. Derek had left the room quietly. Somewhere upstairs, I could hear Lily's music playing. I am 67 years old, and here is what I know about life. I know that love is not always loud. Sometimes it is 7 months of quiet work under a magnifying lamp. Hands that shake a little. An old man learning things he should have learned 40 years ago because he finally has time to pay attention. I know that value is not always visible. The most important things, loyalty, patience, care, history, memory, do not come with a price tag. And when they do carry a price tag, when something like a 1921 Patek Philippe sells at auction for $131,000, that price is not the point. It never was. The price is just the world's way of putting numbers on things that go deeper than numbers. I know that silence is sometimes the most powerful response. Every time someone disrespected me, every time someone dismissed what I'd built or given or tried to offer, the strongest thing I could do was not answer. Not from weakness, from a knowledge that some things don't need defending because they are already true. I know that children can disappoint you, and you can still love them without limit. Cassie is not a villain. She is a tired woman under pressure who made a careless mistake and then a selfish one. I have made my own careless mistakes. I have my own blind spots. Love is not about being perfect. It is about returning to each other honestly, even after the hard moments. And I know, I am absolutely certain of this, that my father and his father and Margaret are somewhere smiling at a pocket watch that finally told time again after decades of silence. If you are watching this and you have a parent who is still here, please listen to me. Listen to them. Not with half your attention, not with your phone in your hand, not with one eye on the door, because you have somewhere else to be. Really listen, because the quiet ones, the humble ones, the ones who walk to the window instead of fighting back, those are the ones who are carrying the most. Those are the ones who have loved you the longest and the deepest and the most completely. They will not always tell you what something is worth. Not because they are hiding it, but because they assume you will take the time to find out. They assume their love is legible. They assume the letter will be read. Read the letter, not just the first paragraph, all of it, every word. Because in those pages, if you are lucky enough to have someone write them for you, is everything that person has never quite known how to say out loud. 7 months of early mornings and magnifying lamps and a cracked enamel dial repaired by someone in Germany who took 6 weeks to make something invisible again. That is what love looks like when it is quiet and old and patient and has nothing to prove. Don't call it useless. Don't ever call it useless. I'm Gerald Whitfield, I'm 67 years old, and I still believe that the most valuable things in this life are the ones you have to be still enough to see. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you love, please hit the subscribe button and the bell so you never miss a story. Leave a comment below. Tell me, is there something someone gave you, something made with love and time, that you didn't fully appreciate until it was too late? Let's talk about it. I'll rate everyone. See you in the next story.